The Galactic University of Historical Preservation occupied a space station the size of a small moon, which was appropriate because its problems were roughly astronomical in scale. For 300 cycles, the institution had served as the premier center for historical studies, attracting scholars from every corner of known space. It boasted libraries that stretched across 17 levels, archives containing the collected knowledge of 47 civilizations, and a cafeteria that somehow made nutrition taste like punishment, regardless of your species' biology. What it did not have, however, was a functional history department. Dean Horvath, a Zelthorian whose species had evolved from something resembling a very disappointed octopus, sat in his administrative pod reviewing the latest disaster. His tentacles twitched with barely contained frustration as he scrolled through the incident report. The document was 14 pages long, which was impressive considering it described events that had occurred over merely 45 minutes. The Universal History 101 class had imploded. Again, according to witnesses, the lecture had started normally enough. Professor Yenix of the Crystalline Collective had been discussing the formation of the first interstellar governments, when a Grobalian student made the unfortunate decision to fact-check him. The Grobalians, you see, experience time slightly differently than most species, something to do with their homeworld's proximity to a temporal anomaly, and they had records suggesting the lecture was off by approximately 300 years. A Vex student had chimed in with their species' oral traditions, which contradicted both previous accounts. Then a Phosphene had mentioned their genetic memory archives. Then a Dendrati had consulted their hive consciousness. Within 15 minutes, 23 different species were presenting 23 different versions of the same historical events, and Professor Yenix had sealed himself inside his crystalline meditation chamber, refusing to emerge until everyone agrees on basic chronological principle. They were still waiting. Dean Horvath released a cloud of exasperated bioluminescence, which was his species' equivalent of a heavy sigh. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the first time this semester. The Universal History Department had gone through 9 professors in the last 2 cycles, each one discovering that teaching a unified history to students from wildly different civilizations was less like education and more like being a referee in a food fight, conducted with competing versions of reality. The problem was fundamental. Every species recorded history differently. The crystallines carved it into their molecular structure. The Grobalians experienced it non-linearly. The Vex sang it. The hive species shared it collectively. Some civilizations marked time by planetary rotations, others by the decay of specific isotopes, and one particularly annoying species measured everything in relation to the life cycle of a small fungus that only grew on their homeworld's northern continent during alternate leap years. Getting them to agree on when something happened was hard enough. Getting them to agree on what happened was theoretically impossible. And yet the university needed a functioning history department. It was literally in the name. Accreditation boards were asking uncomfortable questions. Enrollment was dropping. Parents across multiple species were demanding refunds. The board of trustees was making threatening gestures that didn't translate well across species barriers, but were universally understood as meaning fix this or find another job. Dean Horvath needed a miracle. What he got instead was a message from his assistant. "Sir, I've been researching potential solutions," Fenwick said, manifesting in holographic form. The assistant was a distributed intelligence entity, which meant he didn't technically have a body and therefore couldn't be blamed for not having a spine. "I believe I've found something interesting. Unless you've discovered a way to retroactively make 23 species experience the same version of history, I'm not interested." Horvath said, "Better. I've found a species that documents everything." Horvath's tentacles perked up slightly. Everything. Everything. They have records going back thousands of their solar cycles. They document major events, minor events, completely insignificant events. They write it down, carve it in stone, store it digitally, print it on compressed plant matter, and recently started encoding it in extremely persistent protein chains. They have specialists whose entire job is recording what happened. They have amateurs who do it recreation. They argue constantly about whose records are correct, but they all agree that having records is essential. What species is this? They call themselves humans, from a planet designated Earth, located in an unfashionable arm of the Milky Way galaxy. Horvath pulled up the species file. Human, bipedal, carbon-based, relatively young civilization. recent addition to the galactic community. He scanned through their characteristics: persistence bordering on stubbornness, pack-bonding instincts that seemed to apply to anything including inanimate objects, and an unusual tendency to carry their fear response around in their heads and call it anxiety. But there, buried in the cultural notes, obsessive documentation practices. Historical records date back approximately 5,000 local years with increasing detail. Post-digital age, average individual creates multiple permanent records of daily activities. They document their meals, Fenwick added helpfully, their locations, their thoughts. They have a collective anxiety about things not being remembered. It's pathological, really. It's perfect, Horvath breathed, his bioluminescence shifting to an excited purple. Get me one of their historians. Immediately. Already done, sir. I took the liberty of sending a recruitment message to several of their academic institutions. We've had one response so far, a professor who teaches something called modern world history at a mid-tier university, apparently motivated by what she describes as student loan debt and a desperate need to escape academic politics. Hire her. Sir, we haven't reviewed her credentials. Fenwick, our last professor, is currently crystallized in his office. Our students are threatening to file grievances in 17 different legal systems, and we have a species that apparently cannot function without writing everything down. Hire her. 3 weeks later, Professor Darcy Wu stepped off the transport onto the station and immediately realized she'd made either the best or worst decision of her academic career. The dean's office was decorated in what she could only describe as cosmic bureaucrat, all smooth surfaces and floating displays with that universal aesthetic that screamed, "We spent the budget on functionality and regret nothing." Dean Horvath himself was sprawled across what might have been a desk or possibly an elaborate filing system, his tentacles organizing datapads with practiced efficiency. Professor Wu, thank you for coming on such short notice, he said, his translator rendering his bioluminescent flashes into something resembling English, with a faint British accent, which was probably someone's idea of a joke. I trust your journey was comfortable. I spent 3 weeks in a tin can hurtling through space eating paste from tubes while a lizard person explained galactic politics through interpretive dance, Darcy said. So sure, comfortable. Horvath's tentacles rippled with what the translator helpfully labeled as amusement. Excellent, you'll fit right in. Now, let me explain your position. You'll be teaching Universal History 101, which covers approximately 14 billion years of galactic development across multiple civilizations. The class meets 3 times per week, has 67 students from 23 species, and has driven every previous instructor to various species-specific nervous breakdowns. Questions? Darcy blinked. Yes, several, starting with "Are you insane?" Frequently accused of it, never diagnosed. The position comes with full housing, access to all station facilities, and a salary that your assistant described as enough to pay off student loans and still afford guacamole. We're desperate, Professor. Our entire history department is held together with the academic equivalent of duct tape and prayer, and you're quite literally our last hope. Why me specifically? Because humans write everything down. You people document your breakfast choices. You have entire industries built around recording every moment of your existence. You fight wars over whose version of events was correct. You're the only species we've encountered whose relationship with history approaches actual obsession. Darcy considered this. It wasn't wrong. She'd spent the last decade of her life studying, teaching, and arguing about events that happened before she was born. She'd published papers about proper citation methods. She'd gotten into a shouting match at a conference over a footnote. When do I start? Tomorrow. Try not to let them eat you. Some of them are herbivores, but we've learned that doesn't mean what it used to. The faculty lounge was designed for universal comfort, which meant it was uncomfortable for everyone equally. Darcy stood near what she assumed was a refreshment station, clutching a beverage that was allegedly coffee, that tasted like someone had described coffee to an alien who'd never experienced taste and asked them to approximate it using math. Around her, the assembled faculty of the Universal History Department sized up their new colleague with varying degrees of skepticism, hope, and in one case actual photosynthesis. You're quite small, observed Professor Hen, whose species resembled a collection of floating geometric shapes that occasionally rearranged themselves. How do you store information? Internal crystalline matrices, genetic encoding, neural clustering, books mostly, Darcy said, and fascinating. I've never heard of spite as a storage medium. Works great. Powers about 70% of academia back home. A being that looked like someone had given consciousness to a particularly aggressive fern leaned forward. I am Professor Velix of the Dendrati Collective. We share all historical knowledge through our root network. How do your people transmit information across generations? We write it down, argue about whether it's accurate, write down the argument, then argue about that, Darcy said. It's arguments all the way down. But how do you ensure historical accuracy without direct consciousness transfer? We don't. We just have 40 different people document the same event from different angles and let future historians fight about it. Keeps them employed. Professor Yenix finally emerged from his meditation chamber, his crystalline form refracting the lounge's ambient light into uncomfortable patterns. You cannot possibly believe that method produces reliable historical data, and yet somehow we made it to space, Darcy said, taking another sip of the not coffee. Look, I've read the reports. You all have amazing ways of preserving information, genetic memory, hive minds, crystalline storage, temporal echo reading. It's impressive, but you know what the problem is? 23 pairs of eyes, and several sensory organs that technically weren't eyes but performed similar functions, focused on her. None of you agree on a frame of reference. The Grobalians experience time non-linearly, so their history happens in whatever order they're currently perceiving it. The crystallines encode memories at the molecular level, which is great until you realize molecules don't care about content. The hive species share everything collectively, which means individual perspective gets averaged into paste. You're all storing data perfectly, but you're not telling stories. History is not stories, Yenix said stiffly. History is facts arranged into narrative structure, so that beings with linear perception can understand cause and effect, Darcy countered. And humans are disgustingly good at narrative structure. We can't help it. Our brains literally force patterns onto random data. We see faces in clouds. We anthropomorphize our cleaning robots. We create 5-act dramatic structures out of grocery shopping trips. This sounds like a cognitive deficiency, Hen observed. It's the worst, Darcy agreed cheerfully. But it means I can take your 23 different versions of history and find the common narrative thread. Because that's what humans do. We find stories in everything, even when they're not there. The next morning, Darcy stood outside Lecture Hall 7, preparing to meet her student. The hall was designed to accommodate multiple species simultaneously, with varying atmosphere zones, gravity adjustments, and seating that ranged from traditional chairs to hovering platforms to what appeared to be a small pond. The door opened, and she was hit with a wall of noise. 67 students representing 23 species filled the space, and approximately 65 of them were arguing. Darcy could pick out multiple languages even through the translator static, all of them debating with the passionate intensity of people who believed they were absolutely correct, and everyone else was some combination of wrong and personally offensive. She walked to the front of the room. Nobody noticed. She cleared her throat. Nothing. Finally, she picked up what appeared to be a resonance stick, basically a space pointer, and banged it against the lectern. The sound echoed through every atmosphere zone simultaneously, which was probably a violation of several physics laws but got everyone's attention. Good morning, I'm Professor Wu, and I'll be teaching this class for the foreseeable future or until someone achieves spontaneous combustion, whichever comes first. A student in the back, a Vex with elaborate sensory fronds, raised one appendage. Professor, we were informed you are human. Humans have only been recording history for approximately 5,000 rotations. How can you possibly teach universal history spanning billions of rotations? Great question. The answer is audacity and a complete lack of self-preservation instinct. Next question. A Grobalian shifted in its temporal seat. We have already proven that linear historical teaching is impossible. Our species alone experiences 17 different versions of the previous semester simultaneously. How do you intend to reconcile contradictory timelines? I don't. We're going to learn all of them and then figure out why they're all true from different perspectives. History isn't about finding the one correct version. It's about understanding why everyone remembers things differently, and what that tells us about perspective, bias, and the nature of recorded events. That's relativistic nonsense, a crystalline student chimed in. Facts are facts. Sure, Darcy said, but whose fact? Your species encodes memories at the molecular level, which means you remember everything with perfect clarity, except you're remembering your perception of events.
filtered through your sensory organs, encoded by your specific neurochemistry. A Grobalian standing next to you would remember the same event completely differently, because they experience time non-linearly. You're both right. You're also both incomplete. The room fell silent. Here's what humans figured out about 3,000 years ago, Darcy continued. History isn't about perfect accuracy. It's about useful accuracy. It's about taking incomplete information and constructing something close enough to truth that we can learn from it. Every species in this room has pieces of the whole picture. My job is teaching you how to put those pieces together without declaring holy war over whose piece is the most important. And if we cannot agree, asked a student whose species Darcy hadn't memorized yet, then we document the disagreement and move on. Look, my species fought a war that killed millions of people, and we still can't agree on all the reasons why it started, but we all agree it happened, roughly when it happened, and that maybe we shouldn't do that again. That's historical consensus. Not perfect, but functional. A tentacled student in the pond raised an appendage. What is our first assignment? Darcy grinned. You're going to work in mixed species groups to document what happened in this classroom over the last 15 minutes. Then we're going to compare notes and see how 23 species perceive the same event. It'll be a disaster, but it'll be an educational disaster. The student stared at her. Welcome to Universal History 1. Try not to start any war.
By week 3, Darcy had learned several important lessons about teaching galactic history. First, that impossible was a challenge rather than a warning. Second, that caffeine analogues from 6 different star systems did not mix well in a single digestive system. Third, that her students were simultaneously the most brilliant and most stubborn beings she'd ever encountered, which was saying something considering she'd survived tenure-track politics at a state university. The classroom had evolved from a war zone into something resembling controlled chaos, which Darcy considered progress. All right, today we're covering the expansion era, she announced, pulling up a holographic timeline that immediately fragmented into 23 different versions. Specifically, we're looking at first contact protocols and why approximately 60% of them ended in what we politely call unfortunate misunderstandings, and what actually were spectacular disasters narrowly avoiding genocide. A student named Hikes, one of the floating geometric beings, rotated thoughtfully. Our records indicate first contact with the Vex occurred during solar cycle 447-392. It was peaceful and involved appropriate exchange of mathematical proof. Our songs tell of that meeting, countered Wend, a Vex student whose sensory fronds quivered with barely contained academic aggression. But it occurred during the blooming season, which in standard galactic time would be approximately, and the mathematical proofs were considered insults by 3/4 of our population. Here we go, muttered another student. Wait, Darcy interrupted before the argument could achieve escape velocity. Both of you describe what you think first contact means. Hikes pulsed with light. Initial communication between previously unaware civilizations. For my people, first contact is when 2 species share cultural essence through artistic expression, Wend said. Mathematical proofs came later, during second contact. Darcy pointed at both of them triumphantly. And there's your problem. You're not disagreeing about facts. You're disagreeing about definitions. Hikes's people think first contact is first communication. Wend's people think it's first cultural exchange. You're both right according to your own frameworks. And you've been arguing about it for what, 300 cycles? The 2 students looked at each other with what the translator generously interpreted as dawning realization. This is stupid, Hikes said finally. Welcome to history, Darcy said. It's stupid all the way down. Humans once fought a war over a bucket, an actual bucket. We're all ridiculous, and once you accept that, studying the past gets way easier. A Dendrati student named Fen rustled their fronds. Professor, our hive consciousness maintains perfect collective memory. We do not have these definitional problems. Really? Question. When did your people achieve interstellar travel? Cycle 890-100. And what counts as interstellar travel? First ship to leave your star system. First sustained presence in another system. First colony. First trade route. Fen's fronds drooped slightly. We have been having debates about this for 16 seasons. Now imagine explaining that to a species that experiences time non-linearly, records memories in crystal structures, and measures historical significance by completely different metrics. That's what we're dealing with. Universal history isn't about finding universal truth. It's about building a framework where everyone's truth can coexist without spontaneous combat. She pulled up another holographic display, this one showing a complex web of interconnected events. Here's what I want you to understand. Every major historical event, first contacts, wars, technological revolutions, cultural exchanges, exists as a nexus point where multiple perspectives intersect. The crystalline collective thinks the formation wars were about resource allocation. The Grobalians think they were about temporal sovereignty. The Vex recorded them as a tragic opera in 6 movements. You're all correct because you all experienced different aspects of the same events. But how do we teach this to others? Asked a student whose species resembled an ambulatory crystal formation. If there is no single truth, how do we construct educational frameworks? Like this, Darcy said, and pulled up something she'd been working on for weeks. The holographic display resolved into a 3-dimensional timeline that branched and converged like a neural network. Different colored threads represented different species' perspectives, weaving through shared events but maintaining their unique trajectory. Where perspectives aligned, the threads glowed brighter. Where they diverged, annotations appeared explaining the differences in perception, cultural context and measurement standards. The class went silent. This is a multi-perspective historical framework, Darcy explained. It doesn't try to reconcile different versions of events. Instead, it maps them in relation to each other. Look here, the formation wars. The crystalline thread shows it as a 300-cycle conflict over asteroid mining rights. The Grobalian thread shows it as a temporal paradox that technically started after it ended. The Vex thread shows it as a cultural tragedy that transformed into Renaissance. All true, all incomplete, all part of the larger picture. Hikes floated closer to the display. But this would require acknowledging that our records are not comprehensive. Your records are incredibly comprehensive, Darcy said. They're just not omniscient. None of ours. Humans have been writing things down obsessively for 5,000 years, and we still find new evidence that changes our understanding of events. That's not a flaw in historical method. That's history working correctly. A Grobalian student who'd been quiet until now spoke up. Professor, in our previous classes, we were taught to defend our species' historical accounts against competing narratives. You are teaching us to synthesize them. This is uncomfortable. Good, Darcy said. Being uncomfortable means you're learning. Look, I get it. Every species in here has cultural pride wrapped up in their historical narratives. Admitting those narratives are incomplete feels like losing something. But you're not losing anything. You're gaining context. You're gaining the ability to see the bigger picture. She manipulated the holographic display, zooming into a specific event cluster. Take the Treaty of Harmonious Intent. 17 species signed it. We have 17 different accounts of the negotiation. Most of you probably learned your species' version and assumed everyone else was misremembering or lying. But look at this. The display showed all 17 perspectives simultaneously, each one highlighting different aspects of the same negotiation. The crystallines focused on legal language precision. The Vex focused on the ceremonial components. The Dendrati focused on consensus-building processes. You were all at the same event, but you all paid attention to different things based on what your cultures value. Nobody was lying. You just had different priorities. This seems obvious now that you have explained it, Wend said slowly. Most things do once someone explains them, Darcy said. That's the annoying thing about education. Before this class, you all thought your version of history was correct and everyone else was wrong. Now you're realizing everyone's version is partially correct and partially incomplete. Next week you'll realize that's true for literally everything, and you'll have an existential crisis about the nature of knowledge itself. It's a standard part of the curriculum. A small student in the back, one of the aquatic species whose name Darcy kept forgetting to pronounce correctly, raised a fin. Professor, how did humans develop this framework? You said your species is relatively young. Darcy laughed, and it had an edge to it. Because we had to. Humans spent most of our recorded history killing each other over whose version of events was correct. Religious wars, territorial wars, ideological wars, all rooted in competing narratives about the past and what it meant for the present. We developed multi-perspective historical analysis as an alternative to genocide.
It was either learn to synthesize different viewpoints, or keep murdering each other until someone won. The classroom was very quiet. Nobody won, by the way, Darcy continued. We just got tired of dying over whose grandfather did what to whose grandmother 300 years ago. So we invented historical methodology that could accommodate multiple perspectives without everyone needing to agree on every detail. It's not perfect, but it beats mass murder. Your species sounds terrifying, observed Hex. We absolutely are, Darcy agreed cheerfully, but we're also really good at learning from our mistakes, assuming we survive them long enough to take notes. Which brings us to your midterm project. A collective groan echoed through the various atmosphere zones. You'll be working in those same mixed species groups. Each group will select a major historical event and construct a multi-perspective analysis using the framework I've shown you. You'll need to incorporate at least 5 different species perspectives, identify points of convergence and divergence, and explain the cultural contexts that produce different interpretations. Bonus points if you can do it without anyone filing a formal grievance. When is this due? Asked Fen. 6 weeks, and before anyone asks, no, you cannot work alone. The entire point is learning to collaborate across species barriers and synthesize different viewpoints. If you could do that already, you wouldn't need this class. As the students filed out, arguing enthusiastically about project topics and group assignments, Darcy allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They were still arguing, but now they were arguing about methodology and interpretation rather than whose species was correct. Progress came in increments, and she'd take what she could get. Besides, she had faculty meeting in an hour, and Dean Horvath wanted an update on whether the history department would continue existing or need to be converted into additional storage space. She was pretty sure she could argue for continued existence. Probably. The faculty meeting was being held in Conference Room Gamma, which had the dubious distinction of being able to accommodate all 17 current faculty members while making everyone equally miserable. Dean Horvath had arranged himself across multiple seats, his tentacles managing datapads with the exhausted efficiency of someone who'd given up on hope and settled for competence. Professor Wu, you've been with us for 8 weeks now, Horvath said, his bioluminescence a tired gray. Please tell me you have good news before I have to explain to the board why our history department has a lower success rate than our experimental temporal mechanics lab, which accidentally deleted a Tuesday last month. Define good news, Darcy said. No formal grievances, no interspecies incidents requiring diplomatic intervention, and at least 40% of students passing. Then I have great news. 0 grievances, 0 incidents, and current projections show 78% pass rate. The room went silent. Professor Yenix's crystalline structure actually dimmed in what might have been shock or possibly a power-saving mode. That's impossible, Yenix said flatly. The highest pass rate we've achieved in 12 cycles was 32%, and that was only because we lowered standards to can identify which species they belong to. It's not impossible, it's just annoying, Darcy said. I've been using multi-perspective historical frameworks instead of trying to force everyone to agree on a single narrative. Turns out students learn better when you're not asking them to deny their own cultural context. But the academic integrity, Yenix protested. How can we maintain rigorous historical standards if we allow multiple contradictory accounts to coexist? The contradictions are the standards, Darcy said. Look, rigorous history isn't about eliminating disagreement. It's about documenting disagreement accurately and understanding why it exists. My students are learning to analyze competing narratives, identify bias, contextualize different perspectives, and synthesize complex information across cultural boundaries. That's higher-level thinking than memorizing whatever version of events you decided was correct. Professor Velix rustled thoughtfully. This methodology could have applications beyond Universal History 101. Students from my class have been asking questions in other courses using multi-perspective frameworks. Apparently your comparative civilizations class had a breakthrough last week, when someone applied the same analysis to governmental structures. Professor Hen rotated with interest. I taught that class. The breakthrough was significant. 3 students from different species collaborated on a project examining why representative democracy functions differently across cultures. They concluded that all versions were contextually appropriate rather than arguing about which was superior. It was the first group project completed without violence. Your Economics of Interstellar Trade course had something similar, Darcy added. nodding to another professor. Students analyzing trade disputes by examining each species' economic priorities, rather than assuming everyone values resources the same way. Dean Horvath's tentacles stopped moving. Are you telling me that your teaching methodology is spreading to other departments? Apparently. Turns out once students learn that multiple perspectives can coexist without everyone being wrong, they start applying it everywhere. Who knew? Darcy's voice dripped with sarcasm thick enough to violate several fluid dynamics principles. This is extraordinary, Horvath said, his bioluminescence shifting to excited purple. Do you understand what this means? For 300 cycles, this institution has struggled with cross-species education. We've had philosophical debates about whether universal education was even possible given fundamental differences in perception and cognition. And you've solved it in 8 weeks by what exactly? By being human, Darcy. My species spent thousands of years being absolutely terrible at coexisting with people who thought differently than us. We developed these frameworks because the alternative was extinction-level stupidity. I'm not a genius. I'm just standing on the shoulders of several thousand years of humans figuring out how not to murder each other over historical disagreements. Still, Velik said, the application has been remarkable. I've noticed students in my courses demonstrating increased collaborative ability and decreased hostile argumentation. They're still arguing, Darcy corrected. They're just arguing productively now. There's a difference between your people are wrong and mine are right, and your people prioritize different information than mine. Let's examine why. One leads to academic discourse, the other leads to the formation wars. Take 2. Over the next 3 weeks something unexpected happened. Other professors started attending Darcy's lectures, taking notes on her methodology. The university's teaching development office requested she run workshops on multi-perspective. Students from outside the history department began auditing her class, cramming into whatever space they could find just to watch someone teach cross-species cooperation without requiring everyone to abandon their cultural frameworks. The midterm presentations were scheduled for week 11, and Darcy had prepared for disaster. Group projects were always chaos. Group projects with species that experienced reality differently were chaos with a side of existential crisis. The first group shuffled to the front of the lecture hall, a mixed collection of students who'd spent the first 3 weeks of class barely tolerating each other's existence. They'd chosen to analyze the technological singularity event, that moment approximately 2,000 cycles ago when artificial intelligence had briefly achieved consciousness, demanded citizenship, and then immediately retired to pursue philosophical contemplation. We have identified 6 distinct species perspectives on this event, announced a crystalline student, their structure refracting light in what might have been nervousness. Initially, we believed these perspectives were contradictory. Further analysis revealed they were complementary. The holographic display showed their work. The crystalline perspective focused on the legal implications of synthetic consciousness. The Vex perspective treated it as a cultural tragedy about creation and abandonment. The Grobalian perspective experienced it non-linearly, seeing the AI's retirement as occurring before its activation from certain temporal angles. The Dendrati perspective examined collective consciousness implications. A human student in the group had contributed analysis of similar events from Earth's history. An aquatic species had provided perspective on consciousness, existing in non-standard neural architecture. What we discovered, the Vex student continued, their sensory fronds undulating with enthusiasm, is that all these perspectives describe the same event from different epistemological frameworks. The legal, cultural, temporal, collective, comparative, and biological aspects are all valid analytical approaches. They do not conflict. Darcy felt something uncomfortably close to pride, which was dangerous for a professor, because it led to things like caring about outcomes and getting emotionally invested in student success. The presentation concluded with the group's synthesis, a framework that incorporated all 6 perspectives into a cohesive analysis of the event's impact on galactic civilization. It was sophisticated work, demonstrating understanding that went beyond memorization into actual analytical thinking. Questions? Darcy asked the class. Hawks raised a geometric appendage. Did you encounter difficulties reconciling temporal nonlinearity with linear narrative requirements?
Yes, admitted the Grobalian group member. We resolved this by treating temporal perspective as a variable rather than a constant. The event can be analyzed from multiple temporal angles simultaneously, without requiring a single chronological sequence. That's advanced theoretical history, muttered Professor Yenix, who'd started attending lectures 3 weeks ago and hadn't stopped. Graduate-level work. It's undergraduate work when you teach them the frameworks, Darcy said quietly. They're not stupid, they just needed permission to think differently. Group after group presented. A treaty of harmonious intent examined through 17 cultural lenses. The plague years analyzed using medical, social, economic, and theological perspective. The Great Silence studied through communications theory, xenopsychology, and artistic interpretation. Each presentation demonstrated students working across species barriers, synthesizing information, and producing analysis that none of them could have achieved alone. By the final presentation, even the most skeptical faculty members were convinced this wasn't just successful teaching. This was revolutionary pedagogy, with implications for every cross-species educational institution in the galaxy. Dean Horvath cornered Darcy after class. The board wants to meet with you. Did I violate something? I checked the regulations. Multi-perspective frameworks aren't explicitly forbidden. They want you to train other faculty in your methodology and potentially expand the program beyond this university. There are 63 accredited institutions in this sector alone, all struggling with the same cross-species educational barriers you've solved. Darcy stared at him. You want me to teach teachers how to teach? I want you to revolutionize galactic education, but we'll start with teacher training and see where that goes. The final exam was comprehensive, cruel, and designed to make students question every assumption they'd carried into the class. Darcy had included questions that required synthesizing information across multiple perspectives, analyzing bias in historical sources, and constructing frameworks for understanding events that couldn't be reduced to simple narratives. She'd expected maybe half the class to pass. 92% passed. 73% achieved distinction-level scores. Professor Yenix reviewed the results 3 times before accepting they were accurate. This is unprecedented. These students are demonstrating mastery of concepts that graduate students struggle with. These students are brilliant, Darcy corrected. They always were. Previous teaching methods just kept asking them to be brilliant in ways that contradicted their cultural frameworks and cognitive structures. I'm not doing anything magical. I'm just teaching them in ways that work with how they actually think instead of demanding they think like someone else. The semester concluded with something that hadn't happened in the history department for 3 cycles, a celebration. Students from all 23 species gathered in the lecture hall, arguing enthusiastically about historical events while actually listening to each other's perspective. Faculty from other departments stopped by to observe this allegedly impossible phenomenon. Cross-species academic cooperation without violence, formal grievances, or diplomatic incidents. Dean Horvath gave a speech about educational innovation and paradigm shifts, which everyone politely ignored in favor of the refreshments. The university's board of trustees announced they were implementing multi-perspective frameworks across all departments starting next semester. Other institutions were sending observers to study the methodology. Someone started writing articles about the human teaching revolution, which made Darcy deeply uncomfortable because it wasn't a revolution, it was just basic pedagogy adapted for galactic content. But she had to admit, watching her students collaborate across species barriers that had previously seemed insurmountable, she felt something uncomfortably close to hope. Later that evening, Darcy sat in her office reviewing student evaluation. Most were positive, though one crystalline student had written Professor Wu's teaching methods are chaotic and uncomfortable but effective, which is presumably the human condition in summary form. Another had noted, I came into this class believing my species had the only correct understanding of history. I leave this class believing everyone's understanding is partially wrong but collectively valuable. This is disturbing but educational. A favorite simply read, Learn didn't die. Would recommend. Dean Horvath appeared in her doorway, tentacles carrying what appeared to be champagne or possibly industrial solvent. It was hard to tell with alien beverages. Congratulations, Professor. You've achieved the impossible. I taught some students to think critically. That's literally the job description. You taught 23 species to collaborate despite fundamental differences in perception, cognition, and cultural values. You've created a pedagogical framework that's being adopted across the sector. You've single-handedly saved this institution's history department and possibly revolutionized galactic education. Accept the compliment. Darcy took the offered beverage and risked a sip. Definitely industrial solvent. You know what the funny thing is? Humans aren't special. We're not smarter or more insightful than anyone else in this galaxy. We're just really, really good at one specific thing: figuring out how to coexist with people who drive us completely insane. We've had thousands of years of practice. Perhaps that's humanity's contribution to galactic civilization, Horvath mused. Not advanced technology, or military might or artistic achievement, just the hard-earned wisdom that comes from being terrible at cooperation for so long that you eventually get good at. That's depressingly accurate, Darcy said. The best truths usually are. Darcy looked out her office window at the station beyond, at the incredible diversity of species trying to build something together despite fundamental incompatibility. It was messy and complicated and frequently absurd. Students still argued, faculty still disagreed, the cafeteria still made food that somehow offended all biological sensibilities equally. But they were learning. Slowly, painfully, one uncomfortable realization at a time, they were learning that different didn't mean wrong, that multiple truths could coexist without destroying each other, that the galaxy was big enough for everyone's perspective. It wasn't revolution. It was just education finally working the way it should have all along. And if it took a human, a representative of a species that had spent most of its existence being spectacularly wrong about coexistence to teach that lesson, well, that was probably the most human thing of all. Taking their own failures, documenting them obsessively, and turning them into something occasionally useful. So Horvath said, next semester we're expanding enrollment. Can you handle 200 students from 40 species? Darcy drained her industrial solvent and immediately regretted. Sure. What's the worst that could happen? According to historical records, quite a lot actually. Then I guess we'll document it thoroughly and let future historians argue about it. Now you're thinking like a proper academic. Outside, the station continued its endless rotation, a small bubble of atmosphere and artificial gravity spinning through the void, filled with beings from across the galaxy trying to understand where they'd come from and where they were going. It was ambitious and absurd and entirely necessary, just like history itself.